Military leaders just shattered decades of tradition with a public letter that's sending shockwaves through Washington. A group of 38 active and retired military commanders, including 7 four-star generals, have formally refused to endorse Trump's authority as commander-in-chief in a joint statement released less than an hour ago. This isn't some quiet, private dissent or carefully worded diplomatic disagreement. This is an unprecedented public rebuke from the very people whose careers were built on the principle of never challenging civilian leadership. And the fact that they're willing to go on record means the situation inside the Pentagon has reached a breaking point that most Americans don't even realize yet. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what's unfolding is going to dominate headlines for months, and you need to understand exactly what's happening before the spin machines on both sides starts rewriting the narrative. So what triggered this extraordinary move? According to the letter obtained by multiple news organizations at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time today, these military leaders cite a pattern of decisions over the past 14 months that they claim subordinate national security to political objectives, undermine military readiness, and violate the fundamental compact between civilian leadership and the armed forces. The letter specifically references 3 incidents. First, the abrupt withdrawal order from a critical Middle East intelligence post in October without consulting theater. Commanders reportedly issued hours after a campaign rally where Trump criticized the deployment. Second, the delayed authorization for a NATO joint training exercise in January that multiple sources say was held up because the commanding admiral had previously testified to Congress about budget shortfalls. And third, the most damning allegation, a directive from February 9th instructing the Joint Chiefs to postpone emergency equipment shipments to a forward operating base until certain generals agreed to appear at a White House event celebrating military strength. This isn't about policy disagreements or standard civil-military friction. This is about using operational command as leverage for political theater, and that's a line these officers are saying can never be crossed. Smash that like button if you're starting to see why this matters so much. Here's the full context of what's been building. Tensions between Trump and senior military leadership have been simmering since his first term, fueled by disagreements over troop deployments, clashes with Pentagon officials over budget priorities, and repeated public criticisms of generals who didn't show sufficient personal loyalty. But everything changed, according to sources close to the Joint Chiefs, when a classified directive was leaked on February 11th to the Senate Armed Services Committee, showing direct White House interference with time-sensitive operational decisions. The directive, dated February 9th and allegedly bearing Trump's personal signature, reportedly orders a 72-hour delay on critical resupply authorizations for a base facing imminent threat assessment until 3 specific 4-star commanders agree to participate in a televised round praising administration defense policies. This wasn't about legitimate policy debate or normal command structure discussions. It was about holding military safety hostage for campaign optics. And here's where it really gets serious. When members of the Senate Armed Services Committee reviewed that directive in a secure facility on February 12th, they immediately recognized this crossed every conceivable red line. Senator Michael Thornton, a Republican from Virginia and former Marine Corps officer, reportedly told colleagues in the closed session that he had never seen anything like this in 40 years of military and public service, and that remaining silent would make them accomplices to a fundamental breach of constitutional duty. Meanwhile, Senator Patricia Chen, the Democratic ranking member from California, called the directive the most egregious abuse of commander-in-chief authority in modern history. By the time that 4-hour emergency session ended, 11 senators from both parties had agreed to formally request that the Pentagon Inspector General launch an immediate investigation. But before that request could even be filed, the military leaders themselves decided they couldn't wait for official channels. They took the extraordinary step of going public. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely wild. The letter signed by 38 current and former military leaders was released at a joint press conference held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. at 3:30 p.m. today. Standing at the podium was General Marcus Caldwell, retired four-star Army general and former Joint Chiefs Vice Chairman, flanked by Admiral Jennifer Hartley, retired Navy Thryer who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, retired Marine Corps officer who led forces in 3 combat theaters. General Caldwell, his voice steady but his jaw visibly tight. Read the letter's opening statement. We, the undersigned, have devoted our lives to defending this nation and upholding the Constitution. We have served under presidents from both parties, and we have never publicly questioned civilian leadership. But we cannot remain silent when operational decisions that affect the safety of American service members are subordinated to political calculations. The room of reporters fell completely silent. Caldwell continued, his voice growing firmer. The principle of civilian control of the military is sacred, but that control carries a responsibility to act in the national interest, not personal interest. When a commander-in-chief uses military operations as bargaining chips for political endorsements, that compact is broken. That moment sent absolute shockwaves through the Pentagon and Cap Hill, when a retired 4-star general with 38 years of service and a spotless record publicly declares that a sitting president had violated the fundamental compact of civilian-military relations. It signals one thing. The evidence is so serious that silence itself becomes a betrayal of their oaths. This isn't partisan grandstanding or political opportunism. These are officers who spent their entire careers avoiding politics, who refused to comment publicly on any administration for decades, now putting their reputations on the line because they believe the alternative is watching the integrity of the military command structure collapse in real time. Let me give you some critical historical context. This isn't the first time military leaders have clashed with civilian authority over abuse of command. Think back to April 1951, when President Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur for insubordination during the Korean War. MacArthur had publicly criticized Truman's strategy and advocated for expanding the war into China against direct presidential orders. Truman removed him to preserve civilian control. And while MacArthur had significant public support, military leaders ultimately accepted the decision because it reinforced the constitutional principle that presidents make policy, not generals. Then there was December 1993, when Joint Chiefs Chairman General Colin Powell publicly disagreed with President Clinton over the "don't ask, don't tell" policy for gay service members. Powell testified to Congress expressing concerns about implementation, but he did so through proper channels and ultimately executed the policy despite personal reservations. The key difference that Powell's objections were about policy implementation, not allegations that operational decisions were being manipulated for political gain. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. And let's not forget October 2019, when Defense Secretary James Mattis resigned after Trump ordered a sudden withdrawal from Syria without consulting Pentagon leadership. Mattis wrote in his resignation letter that the president deserved a defense secretary whose views were better aligned with his own. A carefully diplomatic way of saying he could no longer defend decisions he believed endangered national security. Even then, Mattis maintained the tradition of not publicly criticizing a sitting president for nearly 2 years after leaving office. Now, however, it's different. This time, military leaders aren't waiting for retirement. They're not using diplomatic language or going through private channels. They're publicly declaring that the current situation represents an existential threat to the integrity of military command. So, what allegedly triggered this unprecedented reaction? According to the full text of the letter released today, The military leaders cite specific concerns about three categories of actions. First, operational interference. The letter claims there's documented evidence of direct White House orders to delay or modify time-sensitive military operations based on whether commanders have demonstrated sufficient public loyalty to the administration. Second, politicization of military personnel. The letter alleges that promotion recommendations and assignment decisions for flag officers have been influenced by assessments of political alignment rather than operational competence, readiness, and third, erosion of professional military advice. The letter states that senior commanders have been excluded from critical national security discussions or had their assessments ignored when those assessments conflicted with political messaging. Objectives. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Here's what the letter specifically says happened with that February 9th directive. According to the account provided by General Caldwell at today's press conference, the White House Chief of Staff personally called the Pentagon on February 9th at 2:15 p.m. and instructed the acting Deputy Secretary of Defense to hold all authorization requests from three specific forward operating bases until further notice. When the Deputy Secretary asked for the reason, he was allegedly told that certain commanding officers needed to demonstrate better understanding of administration priorities before operational support could continue. 2 hours later, according to the letter, those same three base commanders received calls from a White House political advisor inviting them to participate in a televised round scheduled for February 14th, where they would discuss the strength and readiness of forces under current leadership. The implicit message was crystal clear. Agree to provide public political support, and the authorization delays would be lifted. Refuse, and your troops might not get the equipment and support they need. And here's what should alarm every single American, regardless of political party. This isn't just about one directive or one isolated phone call. If a president can stall critical military authorizations until commanders provide political endorsements, national defense instantly becomes a bargaining chip for campaign purposes. Once that precedent is established, there's no mechanism to prevent it from happening again and again. Every operational decision becomes potentially subject to political litmus tests. Every commander faces the choice between protecting their troops and maintaining their professional integrity. The entire system of military readiness gets subordinated to whoever occupies the White House and what they need for their political survival. This puts Republicans in Congress in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, they face enormous pressure from a base that remains intensely loyal to Trump and views any criticism as betrayal by the establishment. That means defending the president regardless of the evidence, attacking the military leaders as deep state operatives, and framing the entire situation as a coordinated attempt to undermine a commander-in-chief who's finally putting America first. On the other side, they're forced to reckon with the fact that 38 military leaders, including officers they've personally worked with for decades, are publicly stating that national security is being compromised for political purposes. They now have to explain to military families why operational readiness should depend on generals providing campaign appearances, a position that's virtually impossible to defend with a straight face. And here's the tricky part. There's no credible defense. Either the allegations are accurate, in which case the actions represent a fundamental violation of the commander-in-chief role, or 38 distinguished military leaders with centuries of combined service are lying in a coordinated conspiracy, which would require believing that officers who've spent their entire careers avoiding politics suddenly decided to commit professional suicide by fabricating claims against a sitting president. Legal and constitutional scholars are calling this the most serious civil-military crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Professor Elizabeth Warren, a constitutional law expert at Georgetown University and former Assistant Attorney General, told CNN this afternoon that if the allegations are substantiated, there are clear violations of the president's fundamental duties as commander-in-chief. While the Constitution grants the president broad authority over military operations, that authority exists to serve national security objectives, not to extract political loyalty from officers who are supposed to provide independent professional military advice. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Michael Chertoff, former federal judge and Homeland Security Secretary under George W. Bush, added that these allegations could potentially violate multiple federal statutes prohibiting the use of government resources for campaign purposes. Delaying military operations to coerce political endorsements from active duty commanders isn't just an abuse of authority. It could constitute criminal violations of laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of political manipulation of military resources. Even conservative legal scholar John Yoo, who famously defended expansive presidential war powers during the Bush administration, admitted on Fox News this evening that the allegations are extraordinarily serious. He stated that while presidents have considerable discretion in military matters, using that discretion as leverage to obtain political support from commanders crosses a constitutional line that should concern every American, regardless of their opinion of Trump's policies. Now here's something that's getting buried in all the initial coverage, but is absolutely critical to understanding what's really at stake here. Multiple sources inside the Pentagon tell reporters that this public letter represents only the tip of the iceberg. There are reportedly at least a dozen additional flag officers who wanted to sign the letter, but were advised by military legal counsel that doing so while still on active duty could constitute violations of Department of Defense regulation, prohibiting political activity by unformed personnel. That means there are potentially dozens more senior officers who share these concerns, but are legally prevented from speaking out publicly. Think about what that means for a moment. The 38 leaders who signed this letter are the ones who could go public because they're retired and no longer subject to those restrictions. The ones still serving, the ones who are currently in command positions and dealing with these issues in real time, are watching from the sidelines, legally unable to add their voices to this chorus, even though they may be experiencing these exact pressures right now. And it gets even more revealing. According to a retired three-star general who spoke to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity this evening, there have been informal discussions among senior military leaders for at least 6 months about how to address what they perceive as a pattern of politicization that's accelerating dangerously. This general stated that the group considered multiple options, including requesting a private meeting with the president, working through the Secretary of Defense to express concerns through official channels, or even bringing their concerns to the Senate Armed Services Committee and classified testimony. But each option presented problems. A private meeting could be dismissed or ignored with no public accountability. Working through the Secretary of Defense assumed the Secretary would be willing to confront the president, which recent history suggested was unlikely, and classified testimony to Congress would keep the information away from the American people, who ultimately need to understand what's happening to their military. So they made the decision that going public was the only option that would force accountability and transparency. These aren't rash individuals making impulsive decisions. These are careful strategic thinkers who spent months weighing their options and concluded that the threat to military integrity was severe enough to justify breaking with 250 years of tradition that says military officers don't publicly challenge civilian leadership. When people who've dedicated their lives to following orders decide that following orders has become complicity in the destruction of the institution they love, you're witnessing a crisis of legitimacy that goes far beyond normal political disagreements. Share this video right now because people need to understand the full context of what's happening. Here's another detail that should terrify anyone who cares about national security. The letter references specific operational delays that had real-world consequences for force protection. According to the timeline provided by Admiral Hartley at today's press conference, one of the forward operating bases that had authorizations delayed was subsequently subjected to increased hostile fire on February 11th and 12th, just 2 days after the White House directive. While she was careful to note that there's no direct evidence linking the authorization delay to the security incident, she stated that the base commander had specifically requested enhanced defensive systems that were part of the delayed authorization package. Those systems were not in place when the attack occurred. No American service members were killed in that incident, but 3 were wounded, and the base sustained significant damage to communications equipment. Think about what that means. We may be looking at a situation where American troops were put at increased risk, not because of legitimate strategic decisions or resource constraints, but because their commanders hadn't provided sufficient political support to the president. If that doesn't make your blood run cold, regardless of your political affiliation, I don't know what would. These aren't abstract constitutional principles. These are real human beings in dangerous places whose safety may have been compromised for campaign optics. So, let's break down what this could mean going forward. First, the immediate political impact is seismic. There's now a formal public statement from 38 military leaders declaring that the current commander-in-chief has subordinated national security to political objectives. While this statement carries no legal force to remove a president, its symbolic and practical weight is absolutely massive. It signals to other military officers that speaking out isn't career suicide. It gives political cover to Republicans who've been afraid to criticize Trump. It creates a permission structure for breaking ranks that didn't exist 24 hours ago. Before this letter, military officers feared that any criticism would end their careers, and Republicans worried that any dissent would end their political futures. Now, some of the most respected leaders in military history have given them both an example and a justification. Second, it creates an enormous crisis for military morale and civilian-military relations. Active duty service members are watching their former commanders publicly state that operational decisions are being manipulated for political purposes. A poll conducted by Military Times in January found that 61% of active duty personnel already disapproved of how the administration handles military affairs. That number is almost certainly going to spike dramatically after today's announcement. When troops lose confidence that their safety is the top priority, when they believe operational decisions might be influenced by political calculations rather than tactical necessity, unit cohesion and readiness suffer in ways that can't be measured by budget numbers or equipment counts. Finally, looking ahead, the broader implications for American democracy are profound. This fundamentally changes the political landscape. Every Republican candidate in upcoming elections will face questions about whether they support a president who allegedly endangered troops to obtain political endorsements. Campaign ads are already being produced featuring military families, asking why their representatives aren't demanding accountability. This creates a wedge issue that transcends normal partisan divisions, because respect for military service and the principle of keeping troops out of political fights traditionally commanded bipartisan reverence. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective on this. But beyond the immediate political calculations, this is really about fundamental constitutional principles that define our entire system of government. The president's role as commander-in-chief is one of the most sacred responsibilities in our constitutional order. It demands putting national defense above personal political interest. It requires making operational decisions based on military necessity and strategic objectives, not on which commanders are willing to provide favorable press coverage. If a president can delay critical operations, hold up essential authorizations, or manipulate deployment decisions to extract political loyalty from generals, the entire concept of professional military advice is effectively dead. Civilian control of the military becomes civilian manipulation of the military, and the implications for American security would be catastrophic. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you understand the stakes. Here's what makes today's development even more extraordinary. The immediate White House response essentially confirmed the seriousness of the allegations. Instead of addressing the specific claims, instead of disputing the facts of providing an alternative explanation for the February 9th directive, the response was pure fury directed at the military leaders themselves. Trump posted on Truth Social at 4:23 p.m., calling the letter a disgraceful attack by washed-up generals who are bitter about being passed over for positions and who are probably being paid by Democrats to undermine a president who's rebuilt the military they allowed to decay. He specifically named General Caldwell and Admiral Hartley, calling them failures and losers who couldn't win wars and now can't handle a president who actually puts America first. When your only defense is attacking the credibility of the people presenting the evidence rather than disputing the evidence itself, you've already lost the argument. Legal experts and communication specialists immediately flagged the problem with this response. If the allegations are false, if the February 9th directive never existed or has been mischaracterized, the logical response would be to release the actual directive to provide the real context to show that these military leaders are mistaken or lying. Instead, the response is personal attacks and conspiracy theories. That defensive posture doesn't just fail to address the allegations, it actually reinforces them by suggesting there's no factual defense available. This goes far beyond a single controversy or a single news cycle. This is about whether a president can weaponize military command for personal political benefit without consequences. If there's no accountability for allegedly delaying operational authorizations to course political endorsements, it establishes that national security is negotiable based on a president's political needs. It's not just about Trump or this particular administration. It's about whether the presidency itself has any meaningful constraints when it comes to the commander-in-chief role, or whether that power can be exercised purely for personal political advantage, long as the president's party controls enough of Congress to prevent removal. Blows your mind? Hit that like button right now. Here's where we stand. 38 military leaders with impeccable records and centuries of combined service have publicly declared that the current president has violated the fundamental compact between civilian leadership, the armed forces. This is no longer theoretical. It's no longer about policy preferences or partisan disagreements. It's about whether we accept a system where military operations get delayed until generals agree to provide campaign endorsements. When officers who've spent 30 or 40 years avoiding any hint of political involvement decide they have to go public because the alternative is complicity in the destruction of professional military culture. We've entered genuinely unprecedented and dangerous territory. If there are no consequences, if this moment passes without accountability, it sets a precedent that will haunt American national security for generations. Future presidents will know they can manipulate military operations for political purposes. Future commanders will know that promotions and assignments depend on political loyalty rather than competence. Future adversaries will know that American military decisions might be influenced by domestic political calculations rather than strategic necessity. That's not a sustainable model for a superpower that depends on military credibility for global security. Keep a close eye on this story because it's far from